I'd been in for 19 years finally made a sound. If being fully alive meant crossing a line you can't come back from, would you do it? If you've ever carried a secret no one was allowed to know, drop a dot in the comments. You might not be the only one. And if you believe, some stories stay with you long after they end, subscribe. This one doesn't leave quietly. My name is Margot Whitmore. I'm 55 years old, and I've lived in the same cedar-shingled house for over 2 decades, tucked away in a quiet town on the southern edge of Lake Winnipesaukee, New Hampshire. Most mornings start the same here, coffee at 7, the local paper folded beside the kettle, and my husband Richard mumbling into his headset about freight costs and warehouse delays. He's a retired Air Force logistics officer who never quite stopped consulting even after retirement. He says keeping busy keeps him sane. I suspect it just keeps him distant. I used to teach art at the high school before I stepped away a few years ago. Burnout, they called it. But really, it was more like fading. I became the wife who folded sheets too precisely and arranged the spice rack alphabetically, waiting for life to feel urgent again. Then came Julian. He's Richard's son, from a marriage that ended long before I ever came into the picture. We never lived together, at least not long enough to count. A few awkward holidays, a silent Thanksgiving or two. That was it. Julian is 32 now. He's been abroad for the last 5 years, doing humanitarian fieldwork, medical logistics, in Ghana refugee support, in Lebanon, post-storm relief in Honduras. He was always in motion, and now he's back, unannounced, unexplained, and I wasn't ready. I didn't know he was coming. Richard mentioned something vague about Julian being in the country again, but it felt more like an afterthought than a plan. So when I heard the car pull into the gravel driveway and a trunk slam shut, I thought maybe it was a delivery. But then I saw him through the window, shoulders broader hair, longer skin, touched by sun that didn't come from New Hampshire. He looked like someone who had spent years somewhere else, warmer, louder, harder. And yet he was standing there on our quiet porch, like he belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. He knocked only once before opening the screen door. Richard greeted him like a contractor showing up for an estimate. "Julian," he said flatly. No hug, no warmth. Just a nod toward the guest room and a quick return to his laptop. I stood in the hallway, too long, longer than I should have. Julian turned to me. "Hey." "Hi," I said softly. I smiled, though I didn't feel ready. We hadn't lived under the same roof since he was 17. Even then, it was only during school breaks, tight, uncomfortable visits that left the air heavy with everything unsaid between him and his father. I knew the stories, the silence, the resentment, his mother's bitterness leaking into every phone call. But this was different. He was different now, grounded. He moved like someone who had spent years learning how not to disturb fragile things. Richard told me later, he'll be staying for a while, just until he figures things out. That's how Richard says things. Brief, practical, as if emotions are a luxury we couldn't afford. I spent the next morning preparing the guest room. It hadn't been used in months, maybe a year. I vacuumed, changed the linens, folded towels with hospital corners. I placed a lavender candle on the dresser, then removed it 5 minutes later. Too much. Too inviting. There was something strange about preparing a room for someone who already felt too present. At dinner, Richard talked at length about a port delay in Los Angeles, an issue with frozen shipments from Oregon. Logistics, his safe topic. numbers and routes and delays he could control. Julian didn't interrupt. He sat across the table from me, silent but alert. When he did speak, it was to me. "Still cooking that tomato stew you used to make?" I smiled. "I haven't in a while." "You should." I liked that one. That was it. Just a simple comment. But it caught me. No one had referenced anything I'd made remembered or liked in years. Richard didn't notice. He never noticed. Julian's gaze didn't drift. He wasn't flirtatious. He wasn't even particularly warm. But he looked, really looked. And suddenly I felt visible in a house where I had long since faded into the wallpaper. That night I wore a robe I hadn't worn in years, soft, silver gray, just enough weight to feel real against my skin. I told myself it was for comfort, nothing more. But I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't want to admit I wanted to be seen. I walked barefoot through the hallway to the kitchen to refill my glass of water. I didn't expect him to be there. He stood near the sink, sipping from a glass, wearing only loose sweatpants. His hair was still damp. When he turned toward me, our eyes met. He didn't glance. He saw me, and I didn't flinch. I didn't cover myself. I didn't apologize. We passed each other in silence, nothing spoken, nothing touched. But something shifted. It was so subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't been starving for it. Back in bed, I lay next to a man who hadn't reached for me in over a year. Maybe two. Not out of cruelty, just resignation. We had become something practical, safe, predictable. And I had told myself for years that this was enough. That passion was a thing for the young and foolish. But that night, after that one moment in the hallway, I couldn't fall asleep. My pulse thudded like soft thunder under my skin. And I knew nothing had happened. And yet, everything had begun. The morning after Julian arrived, I found myself fluffing the pillows in his room again. I'd already done it the night before. But the bed looked untouched, cold. I smoothed the sheets too carefully, then stood in the middle of the room, uncertain whether to open the window or keep it closed. The air felt too still either way. The guest room hadn't seen much use since Richard's brother stayed here briefly after his divorce. That was over a year ago. Back then, I only did the basics: fresh linens, a towel, maybe a bottle of water on the nightstand. But now I was folding the corners of the blanket, like I was preparing for a guest I desperately needed to impress, though I couldn't say why. I added a second pillow, then removed it, then put it back. I checked the lamp to make sure the bulb was warm in tone. I wiped the windowsill, even though there was nothing on it but sunlight. I even considered putting a sprig of lavender in a little ceramic cup, but the idea felt too personal. I couldn't explain why, but I didn't want him to think I was trying. By the time I returned to the kitchen, Richard was already halfway through his second mug of coffee eyes, glued to a spreadsheet on his laptop. He didn't say good morning. He rarely did. Julian was at the table. He had one earbud in scrolling on his phone and a half-full mug in front of him. He looked up when I entered, took out the earbud. That one small motion, removing it, made something in me tighten. I hadn't felt acknowledged like that in years. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. Richard started talking about shipping delays. Again, vessels stuck at the Port of Oakland, driver shortages in the Midwest. His voice faded in and out like background static, the same way it always did when he got lost in his world of numbers. Julian listened quietly, His eyes flicked between Richard and me, like he was trying to make sense of a language he no longer spoke. We ate in silence for most of the meal. I passed him the salt without him asking. He nodded once in thanks. When he stood up to rinse his plate, our arms brushed just slightly, but the contact sent a pulse through me. That's all it was, skin on fabric. But it registered in my body like a chime, a sound only I could hear. After breakfast, Richard returned to his home office. I lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, wiping down counters that weren't dirty. I found myself organizing the drawer of tea towels, color-coded them by accident. Julian reappeared mid-morning. He stood in the doorway, his body relaxed, one hand in the pocket of his jeans. "Sorry about last night," he said. I looked up startled. "What for? Didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. Being in the kitchen that late." "You didn't," I said too fast. He noticed. His lips pulled into a brief smile, almost embarrassed. "You smiled like you're trying not to," he said gently. I blinked, caught off guard. Then I smiled again, this time, slower, less reflexive. But I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Later that day, I took a longer shower than usual. I dried my skin carefully, taking time with the lotion rubbing circles into my elbows across my knees. The mirror fogged behind me, and I left it that way. It was easier not to look. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine before dinner, Pinot Noir, not too heavy. I held the glass by the stem and watched the swirl of red when I moved my wrist. Julian walked in just as I lifted it to my lips. He said nothing, just stood nearby his shoulder, leaning against the fridge. He watched the glass, not me. "Do you want some?" I asked. "No thanks," he said, "but it looks nice." "Smooth," I said, half laughing. He tilted his head. "You always pick wine that matches the room." That caught me. Matches the room? Yeah. The tone. The quiet. It's like you dress the space to match your mood. I stared at him for a moment. No one had ever said something like that to me before. Not about the wine. Not about the room. Not about me. That night, I chose a different nightgown. Not silk. Cotton, soft and white. Modest but fitted. Something I hadn't worn in months. Maybe years. As I moved through the hallway, barefoot again, I felt a tension under my skin. Not fear, but awareness. Julian passed me this time, holding a folded blanket. We didn't touch, but we both slowed as we passed. A pause, a glance, then silence. In my room, I sat at the edge of the bed for a long while, glass of water in hand. My heart beat steadily, not fast, not frantic, just present. I heard footsteps outside my door. Not hurried, not sneaky, just someone existing nearby. I undressed slowly that night, folding each piece of clothing before sliding under the sheets. Richard was asleep already, one arm over his chest, like he was protecting himself even in dreams. I stared at the ceiling and felt my body buzzing, not from desire, not yet, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being noticed. The sheets weren't dirty. They didn't need changing. But I changed them anyway. I told myself it was habit, but it wasn't. It was the way the pillow still held the shape of his head, faint and unintentional. The way the blanket smelled like soap and something else I couldn't name, something warm, something male. I smoothed the fitted sheet with both hands, palms down, like pressing memory into fabric. I caught myself adjusting the lamp angle again, then refolding a towel that was already perfectly folded. My fingers trailed across the edge of the nightstand, slow. I didn't look around to see if he'd notice. He wasn't home. Richard was in the study door closed, as always. The house had become divided into zones. Richard's zone, spreadsheets, shipments, and speaker calls that echoed from behind closed doors. Julian's zone, quiet motion, calm presence, the occasional guitar riff drifting from the guest room. My zone, the in-between, the hallway, the kitchen, the pause between footsteps. We had breakfast together that morning, just the two of us. Richard had left early for a call downtown and wouldn't be back until late. Julian sat at the table back, straight, sipping black coffee, with the same stillness he always carried. I poured myself some tea, though I didn't really want it. We didn't say much. But the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like pressure. His eyes weren't searching the room. They were on his mug, or the edge of the table, or the way the steam curled up from his drink. But I could feel them shift when I moved, like they tracked my breath. The sleeve of my sweater had slipped slightly down my shoulder, and I left it that way. The sun was still low, casting long gold lines across the floor. Julian reached across the table to grab the sugar bowl, and our fingers brushed just barely. I didn't pull away. Neither did he. I stood to put my cup in the sink, and behind me, I heard him do the same. His presence behind me wasn't close, but I could feel it, like heat before a flame. I didn't turn. "Thanks," he said. Just that. His voice quiet, solid. "For what?" "The tea," he said, then added, in the stillness. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to break it. Later that day, I found myself in the garage looking for a box of old extension cords. That was the excuse I gave myself. I'd seen the box dozens of times. It wasn't lost. But I told Julian I needed help reaching the top shelf. He followed me there without question. The garage smelled like dust and pine from an old broom handle leaning against the wall. I pointed to the top shelf. He climbed up the stepladder with ease like he'd done it 100 times. "I think it's that blue one," I said. He leaned to grab it. The ladder wobbled slightly. Not much, but enough that he lost balance on the last step. His foot missed. His hand reached, and it landed on my shoulder. Firm, full, hot. I caught the ladder's edge and held it steady, but his hand didn't move. We froze. I looked up. His face inches from mine, breath soft, eyes wide but not frightened. Just caught. "Sorry," he said eventually, but his hand remained for another second, maybe two, then slipped away. "It's okay," I said too quietly. We brought the box inside and set it down in the hallway. I pretended to open it, look through the contents, wires, dusty paperbacks. I couldn't focus. Julian stood near the door frame, arms crossed. "You always keep things this organized?" he asked. "Not always," I said. He gave a small smile and left without another word. That night, I wore my old robe again, the one that caught the light when I moved, even in the dark. I walked quietly to the kitchen for water, but paused halfway. There was a message on my phone. From him. Thanks for the wine. And the metaphor. I read it once, then again. Then locked my screen. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. Richard came home late that night. Smelled like dry office air and fatigue. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, then sat in front of the TV with a drink. I sat next to him for a while, nodding at the news, but not watching. Julian never came downstairs. When I finally went to bed, Richard was already asleep, breathing steady, one arm across the pillow like he was saving a spot he no longer reached for. I lay on my back for a long time, my robe still on. my phone screen black beside me. But I felt the words still glowing just beneath the surface. The next day, the weather turned. A light rain tapped against the kitchen windows. I found myself staring out spoon-idle in my cereal bowl. Richard was still asleep, probably dreaming of spreadsheets and shipping ports. Julian entered the kitchen quietly. "Morning," I said, voice lower than usual. He nodded. "Sleep okay?" "Not really." He paused, then said, "Me neither." He poured his coffee slowly. Didn't sit, just stood there watching the sky like it might hold an answer we didn't know how to ask. After he left the room, I touched the side of the sink where his arm had brushed mine. My skin still remembered the weight of his hand on my shoulder and the silence it left behind. That afternoon, I found a reason to linger in the guest room again. I said I was checking the window for drafts, but really, I just wanted to see where the pillow creased. That evening, around 10:32, my phone buzzed again. It was Julian. Just 5 words. "Thanks for earlier." And everything. No emojis, no punctuation. But I read it like a heartbeat. I didn't write back, but I read it again and again. And then I slid the phone under my pillow and lay there, eyes wide open, heart full, room silent, but not empty. When Richard told me he'd be gone for a few days, my first reaction was relief, not joy, not even excitement, just air, a loosening, like the house exhaled with me. "A client retreat," he said. 2 nights, maybe 3. He kissed my cheek, his lips brushing against my skin like folded paper. "You'll be okay?" he asked, still halfway out the door. "Of course," I replied. He didn't ask when he should call. I didn't ask when he'd be back. We were polite, as always. After the car pulled out of the driveway, I stood at the front window, longer than I meant to. The house was quiet. Not freer, just quieter in a way that didn't pretend to be comforting. I poured myself coffee in the kitchen, wearing a thin cotton top. No bra. It was warm out. But that wasn't why. I wanted to feel the air on my skin, the softness of the fabric brushing against me when I moved. I didn't think of it as seductive, not even conscious rebellion. It was about sensation. Reclaiming some part of me that had gone dormant, like skin that forgets it exists unless touched. Julian entered the room a few minutes later, barefoot, rubbing his neck with a towel. His shirt clung slightly to his chest from a recent shower. We locked eyes for a second too long. He poured himself coffee in silence. We stood in the kitchen, 6 feet apart, but the air between us was too heavy to be measured by distance. "I need help bringing down a few storage boxes," I said finally. He nodded. "Sure. Basement? Yeah. Top shelf." I didn't have to explain further. We moved through the hall without speaking. The stairs creaked. The air below was cooler, filled with dust and forgotten seasons. Christmas lights, paint cans, old suitcases. I pointed toward the corner. That one. He climbed up onto the small ladder, balancing with one hand as he reached. I stood just behind, steadying the base with my foot. He pulled the box forward and turned to hand it down. But the ladder shifted slightly 1 foot, wobbling on the uneven concrete. He stumbled, not far, but just enough that his weight came toward me, and his hand landed on my waist. Not a tap, not a grab. It slid, just slightly, across the fabric of my top against my ribs. Then, it didn't move. I didn't speak. His hand remained, warm, open, deliberate. He looked down, then up into my face. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. The box landed between us, with a soft thud. He stepped down, but the hand stayed, just for a breath longer, then gone. We brought the box upstairs and placed it in the hallway. He didn't say anything, neither did I. But when he turned to go, I stayed standing there, one hand still resting on the cardboard, like it might steady me. That night, I didn't go to bed early. I lingered in the kitchen longer than needed. I wiped the counter twice, rearranged the cutlery drawer. He passed behind me, once paused, and I felt the air shift. Neither of us looked. Later, lying in bed next to Richard's absence, I realized how loud silence could be. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, hand resting flat on my stomach beneath the sheet. My skin was warm alive in a way it hadn't been for years. My phone was on the nightstand. I didn't check it, but I felt its presence. The next morning, I got dressed slowly. I chose a navy camisole I hadn't worn in years. Soft silk, thin strap, low back. Over it, I wore a cardigan and jeans that fit better than I remembered. I wasn't dressing for him. I wasn't dressing for anyone. I was dressing for the mirror. To feel how the fabric moved when I did. To hear the faint rustle of silk when I leaned forward over the kitchen sink. He noticed. He didn't say it, but I felt it when he passed behind me and reached for the same cabinet. His hand grazed the back of mine. Not enough to call attention. Just enough to say, "I see you." That night, Richard called. "Everything good?" he asked. "Quiet," I said. He laughed. "Enjoy it while you can." I told him to sleep well. He told me not to wait up. When I hung up, I stood in the hallway for a while, phone still in my hand. The house was too still. I climbed into bed early, lay there alone, arms crossed over my stomach, like protection. But I couldn't sleep. After a while, I turned to the empty side of the bed and whispered, "Do you remember the last time you touched me?" Not out of routine, but because you wanted to. The question fell into the dark, unanswered. The silence, as always, answered for him. The next day, it rained. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the windows that filled the house with something like longing. Julian sat in the living room reading, legs tucked under him on the sofa. I passed by once, then again. He didn't speak, but he watched me. That afternoon, I walked into his room only halfway. "Do you want tea?" He looked up. "Only if you're making it for you too." We sat in the kitchen facing opposite directions, like two magnets that hadn't yet turned. I watched the steam rise from his cup. He watched the way I held mine with both hands. "Thank you," he said softly, "for this." I nodded, but didn't ask what this meant, because I already knew. That night, I lay in bed and didn't touch my phone, didn't check messages, but my body pulsed with memory. His hand on my waist, the weight of his presence behind me, the look he gave me before stepping back, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. And in that pause, between breath and movement, I realized sometimes the most dangerous things aren't what we do. It's what we want and dare not say. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of day no one would remember. Gray, quiet, unremarkable. The kind of day when routines slip by unnoticed and everything looks the same until it doesn't. Richard was still out of town. His voice the night before had been distant, distracted. I might stay another night. Things are running longer than expected. I said I understood, and I did, but not in the way he thought. That morning, I woke early, but stayed in bed longer than I needed to. I listened to the rain tapping against the window. I watched the shape of the light move across the ceiling, and I thought of hands, not mine, not Richard's, his. I dressed simply. Loose cream sweater, dark jeans, a navy silk bra underneath, not for anyone to see, just for me to feel. That secret silk felt like permission. When I came downstairs, Julian was already in the kitchen, flipping through a book he clearly wasn't reading. The pages moved too fast. I made coffee. He didn't speak. Neither did I. We existed in the same space the way people do when something has already happened or is about to, and no one wants to name it yet. Then I said it. I need help upstairs. The hallway closet. He stood without question. We didn't speak on the way up. The air between us carried weight, like fog that hasn't burned off. I opened the closet slowly. Boxes, old linens, a pair of broken blinds. I'm looking for the old photo albums I said though I wasn't. He knew it, but still he knelt and began to move things aside. I stood behind him, one hand braced on the doorframe. He lifted one box, turned slightly, and we were suddenly close. Too close. His shoulder brushed my thigh as he straightened. My breath caught. He didn't move. Neither did I. He turned his head, slowly, our faces inches apart, and there finally no more almost. His hand reached for my face, not with urgency, but like he was touching something sacred. His thumb traced the edge of my jaw, light as a breath. I didn't lean away. His mouth found mine, not in a crash, but in a remembering. It was slow, full, dangerous. His hand slid to the small of my back, pressing just enough. My own fingers tangled in the collar of his shirt. We didn't rush. That was the worst part. The carefulness. We kissed like people who already knew the cost. When we pulled away, neither of us spoke. We stood there breath mingling, in the quiet space of that hallway, in front of a closet that held nothing but forgotten things, and now something unforgettable. He stepped back first. Barely. His eyes still on mine. I shouldn't want this, he said, voice low. But you do. I answered softer. He nodded and left. Not in anger, not in fear, just before something else happened. I stayed there for a long time, hands still resting on the doorframe, my lips still tingling, my skin no longer mine alone. Later I went downstairs. I didn't clean. I didn't fold anything. I just stood. Eventually I moved, mechanically. I washed a dish that wasn't dirty. I wiped a counter that didn't need wiping. I needed the motion. Something in my chest wouldn't stop shaking. That evening, I sat on the back porch. The sky had turned the color of bruised peaches, pink, purple, gold. I held a glass of wine I didn't drink. Julian didn't come outside, but I felt him upstairs, like a second heartbeat in the house. The tension had changed. It wasn't potential anymore. It was memory, and memory is harder to ignore. When I finally went to bed, the house creaked in all the wrong places. My body was too alert, my limbs too quiet. I turned off the light, lay back, and whispered his name. Not out loud, just in my mouth, without sound. But it burned. The next morning, Richard came home. Early. Unexpected. He kissed me on the forehead, then walked past the guest room without pausing. Julian was downstairs, quiet, holding a mug like armor. The three of us sat at the breakfast table. Toast. Eggs. Silence. Richard talked about the retreat. Bad food. Good turnout. Nothing new. I nodded. Smiled, where expected. Julian didn't look at me, but his hand brushed mine when we passed the salt. It was accidental. But I didn't move away. Under the table, our knees touched. And this time, I didn't flinch. That night, Richard touched my shoulder in bed, light, testing. He kissed my neck, whispered, "I miss this." I didn't respond. He moved closer. I let him. But in my head was another hand, another mouth, another hallway, another line that had already broken. Afterward, he slept, satisfied, unaware. I lay awake, breathing like a stranger, in my own life. In the days that followed, nothing was said. And that was the problem. Nothing burned louder than what no one dared to name. Richard returned to his routine as if nothing had shifted. Morning coffee, consultant calls, news at 6. He moved around the house like the structure was still intact. But it wasn't. There was something different in the way he looked at me, not suspicion, not confrontation, just a quiet searching, like someone examining a wall for cracks, unsure if they were new or if they'd been there all along. I responded with practiced normalcy. I asked how the client meeting went. I reminded him about the dentist appointment next Thursday. I made dinner the same way I always did, except I didn't taste anything I cooked. Julian stayed mostly in his room. When we crossed paths, it was brief, careful, measured, no touches, no glances that lasted too long. But the silence between us was no longer still. It pulsed. It carried memory, weight, caution. He left his coffee mug in the sink one morning. I washed it slowly, not because it was dirty, but because his fingerprints were still on the rim. I dried it with a towel and placed it in the cabinet far in the back behind the ones we used every day. I didn't know why. Maybe to preserve something I couldn't explain. That evening, Richard asked me to sit with him, on the couch. Something we hadn't done in weeks, maybe months. He muted the TV and poured wine white, not my favorite, but he didn't ask. He handed me a glass, then looked at me like someone preparing a speech. "We should talk," he said. I nodded, my throat dry. "I've noticed you've been quieter lately, more distant." I wanted to laugh. Quieter. I had been silent for years. "I've been tired," I said. He nodded too quickly. "Work's been draining me too." "I get it." He didn't. There was a long pause. Then he looked at me again. Really looked. "You still want this right, us?" That question. So simple. So cruel. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I didn't lie. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. Just, I don't know. His face didn't crumble. It didn't harden. It just faded, like a curtain being pulled over something too bright. He stood, slowly. "I'm going to sleep," he said. I stayed on the couch for a long time. The wine untouched in my hand. My reflection staring back at me from the dark TV screen. A woman who looked like me, but wasn't sure anymore what her name meant. That night, I didn't sleep. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, looked at myself in the mirror under the dim yellow light. No lipstick, no marks, no story written on the skin, but something inside me was louder than ever. The next morning, Richard left early for the office, said he had to clear his head. I stood at the window, watched him back out of the driveway. His taillights blinked once, then gone. Behind me, the house fell into a deeper silence. I didn't call for Julian. I didn't go upstairs. But I sat in the kitchen. I waited. I didn't know what for. Maybe not a person. Maybe just a feeling that I was still here, that I hadn't vanished entirely into someone's wife, or someone's mother, or someone's mistake. Julian came downstairs hours later. He didn't speak. just poured water, sat across from me. His eyes didn't wander, but they didn't ask either. And still, everything in me answered. That afternoon, I walked through the garden, clipped roses that hadn't fully bloomed yet, pulled weeds that hadn't fully rooted. I didn't think about what had happened. I thought about what came next. Not punishment, not forgiveness, but the space between. That night, Richard made an effort. He opened a bottle of wine, cooked pasta, talked about a possible weekend trip to the coast. Just us, he said. I smiled. I said, that sounds nice. But the word nice echoed in my mouth like something hollow. After dinner, he reached for my hand, held it. I didn't pull away, but I didn't squeeze back. And that was worse, because I think he felt it. Not rejection, but absence. We went to bed early. He kissed my shoulder, touched me, not forcefully, not urgently, but out of rhythm. I let him. I moved like memory. I breathed on cue. But my skin belonged to another moment, another hand, another silence. When he fell asleep, I stared at the ceiling and whispered something I wasn't supposed to say. His name. The next morning, everything looked the same. Sunlight on the floor, coffee brewing, news murmuring in the background. But I had crossed something, not just a line, a threshold, between living and existing, between being seen and being remembered. Julian avoided my eyes that day. So did I. But our bodies remembered. And silence, once it's broken, never forgets. It's strange how long you can live beside someone sharing a bed meal's holidays and still feel like you're living two entirely separate lives, two frequencies humming in the same space, never quite touching. Richard and I became professionals at this, and Julian became the silence between those frequencies, the space that made me aware they were never aligned to begin with. I started looking at time differently, not in hours or days or tasks, but in glances, in how long his hand lingered on a mug before setting it down, in the way Richard would mention something from years ago, and I would realize I hadn't been there in that memory at all. Time stretched and compressed, depending on who was in the room. One morning, I stood in the hallway, hand on the doorknob to Julian's room. I didn't knock. I didn't open it. I just stood there, letting my fingers rest on wood that divided what was allowed and what already existed. Behind that door was not a man I loved. Not yet. But it was the first space in years where I felt known. I sat at my vanity later that day, staring at my own reflection. I wasn't pretty, not in the way I once had been, but there was something in my eyes I hadn't seen before, something sharper, more awake, like someone had finally turned the lights on in a room I didn't know I had. I didn't crave sex. I didn't crave thrill. I craved truth. The kind that lives in quiet corners and long pauses, and in the ache of things you can't undo. Richard suggested we take a weekend away. Just the two of us. Reset things, he said, folding his shirt with too much care. I said yes. Not because I believed it would fix anything, but because I wanted to know how broken we really were. We drove to the coast. He talked about the waves, the weather, a seafood place he read about online. I listened. I nodded. I played the part. But in my chest, something had already left the stage. That night, he reached for me, touched my back, kissed my shoulder. I turned to him, let him. But I wasn't there. Not truly. I was watching it happen, like someone watching her life through the window of a train she missed. Afterward, he whispered, "You've been distant." I answered, "I've been trying to be honest." He paused, then asked, "Is there someone else?" And for the first time in this entire unraveling, I told the truth. There's someone I can't stop thinking about. He didn't yell, didn't accuse. He simply nodded slowly, as if maybe he'd known for a long time, or maybe he had done the same thing in some other way. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. We didn't talk about it again. He didn't touch me. I didn't try to close the distance. When we returned home, Julian was gone. His room neat, bed made, closet half empty. There was no note, just the absence of him. The echo of something that had filled the house and now was folded neatly into stillness. That night, I stood in the hallway, hand once again on the doorknob. But this time, the room was empty, and I opened it, not to find him, but to face the space where he had been. I sat on the edge of the bed, fingers curling around the fabric he had once slept on. And I wept, not for what had happened, but for what had awakened me, and what I no longer knew how to silence. Richard didn't ask. He didn't knock. He just carried on meals, meetings, muttered reminders, but now something had shifted irreversibly. He knew I was no longer his, and I knew I had already stepped into a life that didn't exist yet, but could. In that space, between what was and what might be, I discovered something I hadn't expected. I wasn't ashamed. I wasn't proud either. I was just aware of my body, my longing, my loneliness, my need to be seen as more than a fixture in someone else's house. Julian sent no message, and still I heard him in the silence of the guest room, in the pause before I spoke to Richard, in the way I touched the handle of my coffee mug, holding it longer than needed just to feel. I didn't chase Julian, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what we had shared couldn't be chased. It was never about catching. It was about breaking open, cracking the shell of my quiet life to reveal something still alive underneath. And now I was awake. And once you've woken up in your own life, you can never go back to dreaming. There is a moment right before something ends, when you realize it already has. You just haven't said it out loud yet, and saying it, giving it shape, feels like betrayal. But not saying it is worse, because it means betraying yourself. Julian didn't come back. I didn't know where he'd gone. There was no note, no excuse, no goodbye. Just an empty room and the quiet weight of absence. But his leaving didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like completion, like his part in my life had always been to open something. And now I had to decide what to do with it. Richard moved through the house as if nothing had happened. And in a way, nothing had. No screaming. No slamming doors. No late-night confessions. Just the slow erosion of a structure that had looked solid from the outside. One morning, while folding laundry, he asked, "Do you want to go to the coast next weekend?" I paused, held a shirt in midair. "No," I said. "I don't." He looked up. "Why?" And there it was, the moment. The cliff edge. I can't keep pretending this is working. He didn't speak. He just nodded once slowly. "Is this about him?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. This is about me." That afternoon, I packed a small bag. Not because I had anywhere to go, but because I needed to move, even if it was just through my own house with new eyes. I checked into a bed and breakfast outside town, a quiet place with too many books, no televisions, and windows that opened toward pine trees and fog. I didn't tell anyone. I just went. The first night, I didn't cry. I didn't sleep much either. I just lay in the strange bed, listening to rain hit the roof. And I realized I wasn't grieving love. I was grieving the years I had spent not living, grieving the versions of me that had been too polite, too patient, too invisible. In the morning, I opened the window. The air was cold, fresh. I sat at a small desk with a chipped mug of coffee and started writing. Not to anyone, just to myself. Words like, I stayed too long in rooms where I wasn't heard. Love without presence is absence. Desire isn't a betrayal. Numbness is. I stayed for 3 days. I didn't see Julian. I didn't speak to Richard. I just walked, drank coffee, wrote, sat by the lake, and let the silence speak back. On the last day, a woman at the inn asked, "Are you here for healing?" I smiled. "No," I said. "I'm here because I stopped lying to myself." When I returned home, Richard was in the kitchen. He looked up when I walked in. "You look different," he said. "I am," I replied. We didn't hug. We didn't fight. He poured me a glass of water, set it on the counter, then said, "I'll go stay at my brother's for a while." I nodded. There was no performance, no theatrics, just truth, and the quiet mercy of two people finally letting go. Julian didn't call, and I didn't expect him to. That wasn't the point. He had already given me what I didn't know I needed: a reflection, a rupture, a reason. That night, I slept in the center of the bed, not on my side, not waiting for anyone to fill the space beside me. Just me, my body, my breath. And it was enough. The next morning, I made coffee slowly, opened the curtains. Light poured into the kitchen like something earned. I didn't check my phone. I didn't replay conversations. I looked at the table where 3 people once sat, pretending to be a family. And I didn't feel guilt. I felt clarity. Sometimes love ends with drama. Sometimes it ends in betrayal. But other times it ends the way a candle does, burned all the way down. Nothing left to give. Just warmth that lingers. And a little smoke in the air. And in that smoke, you finally see who you really are. The house didn't feel empty after Richard left. It felt lighter. He hadn't slammed the door, hadn't yelled. There were no suitcases thrown down the stairs, no apologies whispered behind drawn curtains. Just a soft, firm closing of a chapter we both had been pretending was still being written. And yet there was no celebration either. Julian didn't rush in. There was no music. No breathless embrace in the hallway. He simply stayed. The same way he'd been staying. Quietly. Carefully. That evening, we sat together in the living room. The air was heavy with what had already passed and what hadn't yet begun. He sat across from me, a book in his lap unopened. I had a glass of wine I hadn't touched. The stereo played soft jazz in the background, something slow and unresolved, like us. I looked at him, not expecting a smile, or a line, or anything cinematic, and what I saw was not a man waiting to take someone else's place. It was someone still deciding who he was allowed to be. Later in the kitchen, he cooked. He moved around the stove with a calm rhythm, chopped onions, crushed garlic, stirred pasta like he was writing a letter without words. I watched him move, present, unhurried, no seduction, no tension, just care. He served dinner, sat beside me, We ate in silence, then talked about books, whether nothing that hurt. At one point, I laughed, not because something was funny, but because something inside me had finally exhaled. He laughed too, not loudly, but it was the kind of sound that only happens when two people realize they're still human. After the dishes were done, we returned to the couch. He didn't sit across from me this time. He sat next to me still, with space between us. We didn't look at each other. Until he said it, "Do you want to figure this out?" With me. My breath caught, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wasn't used to being asked. Not demanded, not assumed, but asked. I turned to him, didn't speak, just leaned, rested my head on his shoulder. And in that quiet motion, everything changed. Not in thunder, but in truth. Hours later, I passed the hallway mirror. I paused. Not to fix anything, not to search for beauty, just to see. I didn't look younger, or freer, or particularly radiant, but for the first time in years, I saw a woman who was fully present, not smiling for anyone, not waiting for anyone, just here, alive, the kind of aliveness that doesn't beg for fireworks. It asks only for stillness and to be seen without being judged. That night, we didn't share a bed. Julian returned to his room, I to mine. It wasn't about restraint. It was about respecting the echo, letting silence settle in a space where chaos had just passed. And in that space, I found something I hadn't expected: peace. Not the loud kind. The kind that hums in your chest when you stop performing, when you stop pretending you're fine. The kind that arrives when someone sits beside you quietly and stays. Not because it's easy, but because it's real. I used to think people left marriages because of arguments, because of betrayal, or boredom, or some dramatic unraveling you see in movies. But now I know. Most people don't leave when something breaks. They leave when they've been broken inside that marriage slowly, quietly, for years. And one day, they simply stop waiting to feel like themselves again. That's what happened to me. I didn't leave because of Julian. He didn't seduce me. He didn't promise me a better life. What he did, what made all the difference, was that he saw me. Not as a wife, not as someone's mother, but as a woman, breathing, wanting, disappearing. There's something violent about being invisible for too long, not in the way that bruises show, but in the way you forget the sound of your own voice. For years, I moved through my life like a set piece. I folded towels. I made dinner. I responded to thank you with, of course. I watched my husband fall asleep beside me, breathing softly, without ever once asking what was buried behind my silence. And I buried so much. I buried touch, desire, joy, the thrill of being looked at like I mattered. And then one day, I stopped burying. I stood at the edge of the lake the day Richard left. And I thought, how long have I been gone from my own life? Not hours, not weeks, years. And the real heartbreak wasn't that my husband didn't fight for me. It was that I didn't either. Because by the time I realized I was missing, I had already stopped believing I deserved to be found. Julian didn't rescue me. He woke something, and then he stepped back so I could choose it on my own. I used to call what happened between us a mistake, but now I call it a mirror. He held it up to me and said, "You're still here, and you deserve more than survival." He didn't ask me to run away with him. He asked me to stay with myself, And so here I am, not in love, not in pain, just awake. I still live in the same house. The rooms are quieter now, but they don't echo the way they used to. I talk to myself sometimes, out loud, just to hear what I sound like. And I smile when I catch myself humming, because it means I'm still in there. I walk to the lake most mornings. The water doesn't ask anything of me. It just reflects what's already true. And some days, I think that's what love is supposed to be. Not rescue, not possession, but reflection. If you're listening to this right now, and you've ever felt yourself fading into the background of your own life, I want you to know you are not a mistake. You are not too late. And you don't have to wait for someone else to see you, to start seeing yourself. If this story found a quiet place inside you, if it reminded you of something you felt or something you've forgotten, just leave a simple comment with the words, "I'm still here." That's all. No need to explain. No need to justify. Because sometimes just saying those 3 words is how we begin to find our way back to ourselves. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe and share it with someone who may need to hear what you just did. Because some stories aren't told to entertain us. They exist to remind us you're not invisible. You're still here.